Should I just start? Okay. So we're just gonna delete the first minutes for all you who are here. We will delete the first minutes of this meeting, and then we're gonna just like do it all over again because we had some technical issues. So I'm sorry for repeating myself. It's just the circumstances. So welcome to this panel. It's on disability in transnational adoption in Scandinavia. My name is Mette, and I am a PhD student at UC Irvine. And the focus of my work is on disability and race and how kinship is formed around that in transnational adoption in Denmark. I've also in the past done a lot of activist work in relation to transnational adoption. Before I ask the participants to introduce themselves, we'd just like to briefly go over transnational adoption in Scandinavia because there are some overlaps that are important. So in Scandinavia, I mean Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And in all these three countries, transnational adoption started in the 1950s and the 1960s, where it took off. And all three countries have some of the highest rates of transnational adoption per capita in the world, with Sweden holding the world record of being number one. They have the absolute highest number of transnational adoptees per capita. So the total numbers are for Denmark is 25,000, approximately 25,000 transnational adoptees per capita in total, and the population is roughly around 5.8 million people. In Sweden, there are around 50,000 transnational adoptees, and the population total is on 19 plus million people. And in Norway, there are around 9,500 transnational adoptees, and they have a population of 5.5 million. So it's a lot. And one of the most visible features of transnational adoption in Scandinavia is that most of the transnational adoptees are people of color. And that has transpired into the research on transnational adoption, where race and transraciality, minoritization stemming from racism are topics that have continuously been the focus of different studies. But what we want to do today is to bring some awareness on disability and transnational adoption, because it is such an overlooked topic. And this also shows in that there are no records on how many transnational adoptees that were given up because of their disabilities. And so now I would like to ask the participants to introduce themselves. Angelica?
Thank you, Mette. My name is Angelica. I'm from Norway, or living in Norway, originally from Colombia. I was adopted to Norway in 1989 when I was 5 years old. My topic today is to talk about invisible disabilities, and my disability that are grounded in my diagnose, lupus, and I will talk about how that has anything to do with the adoption part. My profession on a daily basis is to be a coach and guidance for people that have fallen out of work and from the work market, and help them to come back after sickness or other things. My interest in terms of adoption is being a political activist. I I'm passionate about the human rights factor for the adoptees and our families. So yes, I will talk more about it later on.
Thank you. And Malin?
Hello. Am I in the video? Yes. My name is Malin Young-Hee Bernt, and I was adopted from South Korea to Sweden when I was 8 months old. I was born with cerebral palsy, and it was discovered when I was 1.5 years. So my parents didn't know that I had a disability when I came to Sweden. I live in Stockholm now, and I work as a coordinator for leisure activities for children and youth with disabilities. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I might have forgot to mention this time around that I was given up for adoption because of my cleft lip and palate. So that's my stake in this. Anyways, the first very basic question that that I have for you is, what does it mean to be disabled? Like, how do you identify yourself?
Sorry, Mette. I'm sorry.
Mitja is here.
Mitja is here.
Oh, great. Hi, Mitja.
So hello, you want me to do the introduction now?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So thank you for, first of all, for Transnational Adoptees United to inviting me to do this panel speak. It's very important for me that somebody is thinking in these matters regarding disability in connection with adoption. Briefly, I was adopted from South Korea to Denmark when I was 3.5 years old from Hold organization. And my disability was not a part of my relinquishment. I got my disability at Hold orphanage. So in the eyes of my biological family, they don't understand how I got disability. I was reunited last year with my sister because of DNA, which is a totally different story. But so I grew up in a Danish family with Danish sisters and brothers. I'm the only adoptee, and it's only recent I had to confront what it means to be disabled, and also in terms of disability rights, because I think it's so important to stress that you have rights if you have a disability, but most tend to take it from an individual stance. It's my personal problem that I have a disability. And in my case, I had a disability with polio, which meant I was paralyzed from the waist and down when I arrived to the Danish family. But I was not raised in a family where the disability was something we talked about. So I primarily had an orthopedic brace to support my leg. And that was the story that's how I was limping, and I didn't walk like other children. And fast forward 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with post-polio, which means the diagnosis that I originally had is now a different diagnosis, where it turns out to be more severe because it's in progress, which means that I have to redefine what kind of disability I had. And it also gave me complex PTSD. So besides struggling with mental health issues in my upbringing, I now had to confront with what does it mean that I now have to use wheelchair, and people see me in the old understanding, but my disability progressed into even worse. And that kind of forced me to kind of go into fighting for my rights, or fighting to be acknowledged for my disability, because I'm always seen for my strength, for my resources, for my knowledge. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I work with very severe patients and young people and parents and school systems, psychiatric ward, people with all kinds of trauma. and suddenly I'm the one being in the system, trying to be acknowledged for my disability and my vulnerability. And so in 2019, I decided to do the first workshop regarding disability and adoption in Seoul for adoptees, and having the first conversation regarding disability, whether it was mental or physical disability. So I'm gonna stop here and just make a concluding remark. You might, the viewers of this conference might just saw a glimpse of what does it mean to have a complex PTSD reaction. So this feeling for me was showing up in this conference, right? The feeling of being excluded, the feeling of not being able to get access, the feeling of not being able to cope, and you cannot even use the normal cognitive or mental strategies, because if your brain is flooded with almost going into full panic, you have to use all your mental capacity to calm yourself and still reach out and say, I need this information. This is what I need. I need to be on the computer and not on the telephone. So you might imagine in other situations where I'm denied access, or I have to fight for something regarding my wheelchair or something, that I'm struggling also with how to regulate and communicate in that very stressful situation. And it can be a small trigger. So just the mere feeling of being excluded, discriminated, or expected that I should just, do something that you can do without a stress, this difficulty managing stress, difficulty regulating your emotion in highly stressful situation. That I think is very difficult for the outer world to understand, because they only see the wheelchair or they only see the physical disability, but it actually has high impact in how to use your mental faculties as well and stay calm and sane. Just to put that explanation to what you might or might not notice when I tried to enter the conference earlier, right? So hope it made sense for you.
Thank you, Mitja. I just want to, because this is the second take, and we're recording this and it will be transformed into a podcast or a video. I just want to explain we had a technical issue that was very unfortunate, and Mitja, you explained it so well. I've learned something from this experience and by you explaining it, so thank you. So the first question we have is, what does it mean to be disabled to you? And the topics we're going to talk about here is how do you identify yourself as being disabled, and what are the barriers that come with it, and how does it relate to your gender? So feel free to just chip in.
So I can start.
Yeah.
So the moderator has to moderate how much time I have, because that would be my problem if I'm engaged in something I'm very passionate about, or if I'm very angry about a topic. Then it's good that somebody says, oh, you have 2 minutes left or something. So I want to start because, of course, everybody has a personal entry point into why you want to dig into a certain topic, right? In the community for adoptees from Korea in particular, that's the only experience I have, is we talked about racism, we talked about gender, we talked about all kinds of discrimination and gay, lesbian, mixed families, dating life, etc. And from my point of view, I felt it was very important to touch upon the topic that I state and say that we are probably highly overrepresented of the children who were sent overseas from Korea to Denmark, probably also some of the other adoptee groups from other countries, because this notion that Denmark is a country with a high welfare system, good hospital system. You can get good treatment, you can get surgery, etc. I think that is mixed into the story of you can get a good life, good upbringing, and maybe a good education in a Scandinavian country like Denmark. And so for me, it took many years to kind of name the fact and take ownership of I am a disabled person. It doesn't mean I identify myself as being only disabled, but the reason it is important is once you name that you have a disability, it gives you, I wouldn't say privilege because it's not privilege to be disabled, but it gives you access to certain things that you are entitled to. That is your prerogative. You are a person with rights. You're not a person with difficulties because you were abandoned. You're not a person with difficulties because you had a different upbringing. Well, if you have a disability, and it might be you struggle with PTSD, right? Which is also a disability. You have rights, but you cannot claim those rights if you keep saying that, oh, it's just a minor thing I have. In my case, I just limp with my one leg. I can't run. I can't do a marathon. I can't dance. Or maybe it's difficult dating. But the minute you name that, oh, I have a disability, I think the services changes, the way you're being treated changes, your economical rights, your social rights. When you're being evaluated, how much hours can you work? What kind of things can you get for free? Of course, you have to make a lot of applications. Things like this changes, right?
So,
And in my story, I just want to wrap it up saying, the difficult part for me with taking ownership of the disability was I was abused in my Danish family because of a special interest in my disability, like a kind of fetishism or kind of incestual. So that also explains why it's highly sensitive topic for me. So for me, it's empowering to say, take the ownership of the disability.
Curious. Yeah, I'm curious if you could elaborate both on what particular rights you say that you've gained access to by claiming, I don't know if you would express it that way, but by naming yourself as someone who is disabled. And I'm also interested in that shift that has happened in your way of perceiving yourself, from going from maybe not so much viewing yourself. I don't know if you can ever view yourself as being completely normal when you are being disabled, but to have gone to have taken that step towards a greater acknowledgement of yourself as disabled. I'm interested in that shift in self-perception.
Well, in my case, I was forced to go even closer, go even more direct into I am disabled, because in the Danish welfare system, you cannot get things without making applications. And I'm talking about there's a lot of cost involved with being disabled. In my case, I need a lot of assistive equipment. I'm not going to go into the field of being a psychologist trying to work less hours, because that's a whole chapter itself, how to be acknowledged for not being able to work full time. I'm just going to try to go into the assistive devices and the basic equipment you need to compensate for your disability. In order to get those, you need to make applications. And I'm sure it's the same in Sweden and Norway, right? I see Angelica nodding. So you might have, how can I say, for my understanding, it would have been more understandable had I gone into a traffic accident and being even more paralyzed, because it would be obvious for the outer world that my disability had changed into what is called post-polio. So I have to protect that it doesn't get worse by not overusing my nervous system and my muscles. But since I was not in a car accident, I would look the same, you know, and I can open my mouth and I can speak and I can, you know, make demands and I can communicate and I can, if I'm not stressed, I can make really good applications. But if I'm stressed, I cannot use my brain. So you need to reach out. That was my first stance. I was forced to reach out for help, right? To get your needs met, you need to be able to take ownership and say, this is my struggle. And if you're not aware of that, it all stems from your disability, you might fall into the pit and think it's because I should work harder or better or more clever or take another course or educate myself better or not, you know, nobody wants to be a victim. Nobody wants to have special attention that now I can't participate in this, now I can't do this. So I think it's normal for the human brain to try to compensate by working even harder, trying even better, right? But in my situation, just as if I was in a car accident, you have to get a wheelchair, you have to get crutches, you have to get a special chair, you have to go to special training and a special hospital, you have to apply for special transportation, you have to apply for special equipment so that you don't use muscles more than necessary to preserve, to conserve your energy and spread out the energy over a week or so, right?
Yeah, I have. So I see Angelica is raising her hand. I have a couple of comments that I want to make.
Yeah, so let me just wrap up the right to these things. To get it free, you need to make application, but it all stems from the UN Charter, the UN Convention on Disability Rights. That's where it all comes from, right? Some people sat down and fought hard to make sure that disabled people were not discriminated. And those UN laws have been fully or partly or tiny implemented in national law. And I'm sure Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland are almost on the same level.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to make this brief comment, and I think you touch upon something where I've experienced myself that when you are verbally capable of compensating for what is perceived as a vulnerability, there is maybe a tendency both for yourself and also for your surroundings to not take notice in your disability as much. And so it can often get overlooked. And personally, I have also, until very recently, had the desire to pass as able-bodied, and so you're actually enforcing that process. So that's just what I wanted to say. And Angelica, you had your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on what Mitja just said, because it's definitely something I have experienced. When you're not acknowledging your disabilities, people are not acknowledging, or the system is not acknowledging it. And for me, when I grew up, I have a invisible disease. So I have invisible disabilities, or they're visible, but people don't see me as sick. So when I was growing up, I had a lot of pain. When I was walking, I had a lot of pain. When I was moving around, especially in my legs and in my arms, I often had a lot of pain, but I look very healthy. And people didn't see anything on any test and anything, because lupus is very hard to find. It's hard to identify that you have lupus, because it gives you a lot of inflammation. Betennelse, is that inflammation? Yes. I'll say so. Yeah. So I had a lot of inflammation in different part of my body that hurted me a lot, but they didn't see it and they didn't find it. And because I was adopted, people was just thinking that I was searching for uppmärksamhet.
Attention.
Attention. Thank you. So I was searching for attention, and that I was just making myself difficult. And when I was starting to lose a lot of weight, I was losing 12 kilos in 1 month without doing anything special. They was just thinking that I was depressed because I was adopted, and everything that happened with my body and thing that was unexplainable, they just put it on the adoption knogg. I don't know how to say that in English. So they just said that everything that happened to me was that, and I thought it as well. And I didn't understand why I was so much tired and more exhausted than others. I was looking at people in my same age group doing exactly the same activities, and I didn't understand how they can do that without being extremely tired and like overwhelmingly tired, because everybody kept telling me that I was healthy, and they only thought it was my mental health because I was adopted, and because my adoption also was not a good adoption. I had abusive parents, and they just put everything on that. So it was when I was grown up and I lost a child during pregnancy, and my blood samples didn't balance after losing the child, then they started to think that maybe it's something else. And I almost lost my kidneys before they figured out that I had lupus. And then they then at that moment it got really serious for people around me, for the system. Then they were like, oh, you have a really serious disease and you need to go on very heavy medication. And then suddenly I was very sick. And then I got to apply for some help and some fundings, and I got help to school, because at school as well my concentration wasn't good because I was so tired. And like you said, Mitja, when I'm stressed, my cognitive function also lowers. So it's difficult to concentrate, and when there's a lot of things to do at school, it was difficult. So as soon as I got the diagnosis, I could apply for help, like longer time on test, help with the lightning, stuff like that. So having a diagnosis helps, but when it's invisible and it's like lupus, which is kind of hard to find, it's very difficult to be disabled and not acknowledged for the things you are experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it touches upon something we will talk about in a minute, how disability is related to adoption. Malin, do you have any thoughts on what it means to you to be disabled?
Yes, when I was a child, I was really ashamed of my disability. I was walking with crutches until I was 9 years old, and I wasn't able to walk so long distances. I was walking very slowly, so I had really hard times to catch up with my friends. So I was quite excluded in the school. And when I was 9 years old, I hurt my knee. So then I got a wheelchair, and most people think the wheel, if you get a wheelchair, then you're really disabled. But for me, it was a very positive thing, because when I got a wheelchair, I was able to move around a lot more freely. and I could, you know, in the school when you take food, I don't know what it's called in English, but then I could carry my tray, my food by myself. I didn't need any help. So I got more self-dependent when I got the wheelchair. And I really had so much depressions, and I recognize what Mitja said about. I also guess I had complex PTSD, and I was really traumatized, and I was not able to be social, so much social, and I was really quiet and dissociated a lot when I was a child. So when I was 14 years old, my life changed because I found wheelchair basketball. And then I finally met people that saw me, you know, not my disability, because earlier all people saw was my disability, I thought, because they were always commenting it, you know, and they felt pity for me, and you know, so I was identifying myself as a disabled person, and I hated it. So when I was 14 and met these you know, wonderful people also in wheelchair, they were older than me, I got role models, and I felt that, oh, I can also, you know, I can have a good life in a wheelchair too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how your disability has been visible. Meanwhile, Angelica talked about how Angelica, you talked about how your disability was invisible, and how that plays. Can you hear me, Angelica? Yeah, and how that.
I'm sorry, I just have some kids that are talking, so I'm trying to listen.
Yeah. And what I was saying was, I think it's interesting how Malin put an emphasis on her disability as being very visible and being defined by it from your surroundings. Meanwhile, Angelica, you talked about how your disability was invisible to the world, right? And how that comes to define you in a different way because you struggle for acknowledgement. Meanwhile, it was the opposite for Malin. In my case, I also had a very visible disability. I looked very different when I was growing up, and so I think I was busy appearing as normal as possible because it didn't hinder me physically in my motility. And so I was trying to overcompensate by doing a lot of sports and what else. Yeah. So that was just a comment I had. I also want to say, just because I don't want to take up too much space, but I also want to acknowledge that you all being very vulnerable by sharing your stories. I just want to mention a few things about myself. So I have not. I think there are some similarities between Mitja's story and my story, in that I have not really acknowledged that I was disabled as such up till very recently, till I started working on disability and transnational adoption. I started to be active in the critical adoptee community back in 2013. But up until a few years ago, my focus has been on race, and I think that it was because I was able to find a community, and so the thing of having to confront your own disability is just an extra step towards marginalization within your own group. And so it does, at least for me, it has taken a long time to come to terms with that I am disabled. And it is still, I'm still in the process of understanding myself and with through this category. So yeah. So the next topic we have is the relation between being disabled and being adopted. And Angelica, you, as I said, you mentioned something about how your symptoms were being interpreted differently and how it was not lupus. And I found that very interesting, how these symptoms can be interpreted depending on what context you're in. So I don't know if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, I can. It's like for a long time I said that I did get a diagnosis very early, and the diagnosis was adoption. Like I was adopted, and everything that I could say about me, about like I went to a scout trip, and they wanted me to have this big bag on my back and walk for hours. And I was crying because I had so much pain on my legs. And all they said was like, okay, she's crying because she's adopted. She needs extra attention because she's adopted. And when I said it was because of my legs, they just didn't think that it was that awkward. So I had this diagnosis adopted for so long that I actually believed that I was hypochondriac, and that the adoption had done that to me, that I was traumatized, and that's all the hurting was because of the trauma. But another thing is that I know lupus is autoimmune sickness, and autoimmune, it's all it's been researched that autoimmune sicknesses also is higher attended, like more people that have autoimmune system diseases have some kind of trauma in the backpack that the background is from trauma, and that our immune system are very closed up to the traumatic experience we have. And sometimes I was thinking, like, why didn't they think more about autoimmune sickness when I said all the pain, and they knew that I was taken from a family. They don't know nothing about my family. The family could have been very traumatized because we come from a country with conflicts, and it's a lot of things I've been thinking about growing up, knowing more about autoimmune sickness and lupus, that just crossed my mind. It's very much connected, that that some of this autoimmune sickness can be not a result, but be triggered by all the trauma that you experience. I don't know if it makes any sense for you.
Yeah, it does. And what I hear you say is also that when, so this is where adoption plays a major role. When you are adopted and you don't know your family history, the interpretation of the symptoms will happen in a certain context, right? And
Yes.
it's in the welfare state. It is through that lens of you being an adoptee. And so the conclusion to these interpretations will very much depend on this context that they're set in. And so it can actually obscure the result, or with this I mean it can hinder the medical process of
Yes.
figuring out what diagnosis you should have, because everything gets read. But when there is this hole, you can basically put everything through into that hole, right?
Exactly, especially when it's not visible. And I think a lot of people are diagnosed with ADHD and stuff like that. So a part of the diagnosing just because you're adopted and have difficulties that they cannot point fingers at, like they don't understand what the difficulty is, and then they just put it on the adoption because it makes sense somehow. And in that, you teach us that we are not valued in the same way, because other people might say they are in pain and then they are like more researched than if you think it's only because of trauma, only because of the background and yeah, stuff like that. So for me, it was a big part of being disabled and adopted that made the progress go so far that I almost lost my kidneys before they actually understood I was physically sick as well, not only traumatized.
Mitja and Malin, do you have any thoughts on the relation between disability and adoption? Yeah, Mitja?
Yes, so what I noticed is that I think that if you are placed in a family who doesn't know your background, your medical history, how many traumas you had to survive, and it's kind of like they accept that. So we don't know where you came from, but in my case, it would be you're not different from the rest of the children, right? Which I obviously was. So this idea of treating, so I'm in a family with 4 siblings. So this idea of treating all children equal is a major mistake, I think, because in order to treat your children fair, you need to treat them individually, accordingly to what are their needs. And especially if you have some kind of disability, you might have special needs. But so that's where I know that's a different question you're going to ask about adoptive parents and being raised, the narratives they put on you. But for this question, I would say it seems like that the adoptive parents don't approach your conditions the same way they would as if it were their own biological children, right? When I think back about my history, a big reason of my struggle in understanding and rescripting my upbringing and my identity and my self-understanding is the way they didn't approach it. And when they did, it was in an abusive way. If you can understand how it messes up your understanding of what you're supposed to deal with, what you're supposed to cope with on your own, because it's like, this is a package. You're adopted, and then you kind of have to cope with it. But I don't think a non-adopted person, a non-adopted child would be, I think that child who is not adopted would be met with much more care and understanding and curiosity, and take you to the doctor, whatever. And so I can only speak for my case. It is a discovery I had to understand as an adult, whereas most people who have a disability in Denmark, if I want to mirror myself in other who have maybe not the same but similar condition in terms of level of functioning, most of them are used to understanding and knowing the disability from childhood, from birth. So the difference is, if you are adopted, you kind of have to discover, what is this? And I'm not just talking about your medical history. I personally have my medical records from the orphanage, but a lot of adoptees don't, right? I'm talking about the conversation in the family about your unique needs or your special needs or different needs, or that it's kind of, I think it goes into that sort of narrative that my parents wouldn't say this directly, but I would hear it from others, that, oh, you must really have some really good parents, and indirectly say you must really have got a really good life that you couldn't have had where you came from. So on one hand, you would be acknowledged that you manage despite your disability, but they won't mention the disability because, how can I say, that has been a big struggle for me to understand. They wouldn't directly say, we see that you have a disability. I mean, in my case, it was physically visible, right? They would kind of always point to how well I adapted or was integrated, or how well I spoke, or how well I fit into that narrative of being very well assimilated, right? And in that narrative, your otherness, your disability disappears. Does it make sense? In a way that wouldn't have disappeared had you been a child who was not adopted.
Yeah, I think so. So that there are two things that I want to comment on. The first thing is, and I actually never thought about it, but it's such a great point. I would say that in my case, it was different. I did not suffer the abuse that you had, and I'm so sorry to hear that. I think it was because I was adopted in the 80s through UTAD. And in Denmark, Tadasam in that period was licensed to take care of all the children who were
Difficult to place.
Yeah, with a handicap, either minor or major handicap. So my parents deliberately went to Tadasam after they were not able to get a fast process through any of the other adoption agencies. And so they knew what they were going into to a certain extent, and they were so eager to become parents that I think that my disability has more played into their need for taking care of a child, and so that just added to it that they had someone they could take care of. What to get back to what you pointed to, which I never thought about, was that I never thought about it in terms of my own parents, but I definitely think that you're right. That so in my case, with having been born with a cleft lip and palate, this is heritable. And it means that I would most likely, had I stayed in Korea, or had I been born in a family here in Denmark, I would most likely have had someone in my family, and not necessarily in my immediate family, but somewhere in the periphery. I would have had someone who would also have had it. And so there would have been a certain recognition and familiarity with it. And I think you have such a great point in how there is a lack of recognition, and maybe because of this, the reaction to that can easily become to silence it, because the parents are not equipped to talking about it. And so if they don't make an active choice to engage with it, perhaps this is the only choice they actually have available. Like this is cognitively the strategy that becomes available, because you don't have the personal experience with these things. And the other thing you also mentioned is something I thought about myself, how disability sort of just enforces the narrative of gratefulness that dominates transnational adoption. So yeah, Malin, I don't think we've, have I asked you about this?
Yes, when I was a child, my life evolved around my disability, because, as I said earlier, that was what people saw and reflected back on me. So I was struggling a lot with first, being marinated in this disability thing, and then my teenage years, I tried to disidentify myself from being disabled. So I was extremely self-dependent and didn't want anybody to help me with anything. yeah, it took a lot of years to accept my disability. And when I did that, then I started to be, you know, to open the door to adoption, because I had no space for that before. So when I was 40 years old, I went to South Korea for the first time. Before that, I traveled all around the world. I traveled alone to India, to Thailand, to Brazil, to, you know, a lot of countries. But I didn't want to go to South Korea because I felt such a resentment that they threw me out, or they sold me, or whatever. I you know, I didn't want to go back there, and you know, open that Pandora's, you know, thing. So these two themes have been really big in my life. Yes.
So what are your thoughts about South Korea's heavy stigmatization of disabled people? How is it for you as an adoptee to return to South Korea with the knowledge that disabled people are so heavily stigmatized in South Korea?
Yeah, it's really sad, because when I went to South Korea, we visited like an institution. You know, they have still institutions for children and adults with disabilities. So when I went there, they, you know, they mixed all these young children with very different kind of disabilities, and they did that in Korea like we had in Sweden 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And I was really feeling bad when I was there because they were treated the same, you know, and they were so different. And so I have really been engaged in this, that they are on their way, not very close, I guess, but hopefully they will disinstitutionalize. So I hope there will be no more institutions in South Korea in a very short future, because it's not human, you know, it's not human to be in institutions. Yes.
So one comment I have on this is I have thought about this, like the differences in the way disabled people are being stigmatized between South Korea and Denmark. I think I have been sheltered in the way that I now pass as being fairly able-bodied. When I go to Korea, I don't know what they say behind my back because I'm not in any way fluent in the language. So I'm just familiar with this through like reading texts in English. But I do know that there is a heavy stigmatization, and this is probably primarily the reason for why I was given up for adoption. I also know from my parents that they didn't have the medical resources available in South Korea at the time. And so because it is such demanding disability that I have, that they would have had to fly me back and forth back and forth to South Korea, to a country where they would have the resources available. But at the same time, here in Denmark, it's stigmatized in a different way, where there is this quest to be normal and to and it's not just in terms of whiteness, it's also in terms of being perceived as being disabled. And I don't think I realized that until recently how forceful it is that yes, you are being accepted. You're not. It's not considered. What can you say? I mean, you are being accepted, but it comes with these. It comes. It comes with these expectations that you shouldn't be too open about your disability. Whenever you talk about health in the public space, that you're very restricted in how much you can actually share because it's considered to be private. Your health is considered to be private, and I think that is really like the difference between the discourse on race and disability, where people of color have fought for so long to push for change and more openness about racism that by now the medias, the broad medias, they have representation of this, of personal stories that are considered as resistance towards the system, where the private is used politically. But I do think that there is a lack here in Denmark in terms of disability, where the disability is still being perceived as private, and there is a lack of understanding this as a push against the system. When you share personal narratives of your disability, it's not perceived as a radical statement to talk about discrimination of disability to the same extent as it is to talk about racism in Denmark. That's just my personal opinion. So, yeah. We also had this topic of infantilization. So I mentioned this in our shared Google Docs because I thought it was interesting how both you as an adoptee, but also as a disabled person, are prone to sometimes be infantilized. And so I'm just curious to hear if you if this is something you have experienced and what your thoughts are on this.
Just a question, Mette. If we should have a break or...
Oh yeah. Yeah. Do you want to take a break now for 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think it's good because we stop at 12:30, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Okay, so we will return in 10 minutes, so that will be 11:50.
Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. Hi, Mitja.
Hej Mette, jeg vil lige spørge, hvornår vil I gerne åbne for spørgsmål? Det er bare sådan, så jeg lige kan prikke jer tidsmæssigt.
Ja, vi har lige, talt om det her. Vi tager lige den der med infantilisering, og så går vi videre til spørgsmålene.
Okay, fordi når vi går til spørgsmål, så bliver jeg nødt til at pille den her panel mode af, fordi ellers har vi svært ved at se, hvem der rækker hånden op. Så ryger vi tilbage til gallery mode. Det er bare så I er klar over det.
Ja.
Mm.
Det 11:50 vi skulle börja.
Ja.
Okay.
Gabriel, er du i Sverige?
Ja, det är Sverige. Malmö.
Okay.
Malmö. Ja, jättebra, jätteintressant det ni har sagt. Very interesting.
Tack.
Och Mitja,
Well, I'm glad you think so, Gabriel.
yeah, no. And Mitja, you did great, and I'm so sorry I accidentally kicked you out before.
Yeah, you owe me.
Yeah, I do. I'm sorry, but you handled it very well, and yeah, very good. Yeah.
Okay, are people ready to start?
Yeah, I think you should just start, and then people will be ready.
What about Angelica?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so we got all the pen members. That's the most important thing.
Mette, maybe you could clarify the terminology with infantilization, because I think it would be a word that could be a bit struggle for some of the audience to understand. What do you mean by that?
Okay, yeah. So what we talked about before the break was I briefly introduced the next topic of infantilization, and what that means is to be perceived as being more or less a child, and so when you're an adult, it also means that you are disempowering the person by infantilizing this person. And so what we'll do now is we will talk about this topic, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. I should say with the Q&A that we I have Lisa with me here. We're sitting in her apartment right now, and she will go through the questions, and there was something about the order of the questions that might
So just a list of people whenever they're asking questions. So whenever you raise your hand, can you hear me?
Yeah, so when you raise your hand, we might not do it in order simply because of the way Zoom works, and we apologize for this, but we will do our best, just so that everybody knows it is not a deliberate. Okay, so just to get back to the topic of infantilization, as I mentioned, it is a way to sort of degrade the person you're infantilizing by perceiving a person more or less as a child. And there is a tendency for adoptees to experience this at times. And it is in many ways rooted in colonialism and the way people of color historically have been framed. And so I think that there is an overlap between this and how there is also a tendency of infantilizing disabled people, because when you are being perceived, or when you are being disabled, you're more or less also being impaired, and that means that we are being perceived as being less capable of whatever it is, and so it taps into our understanding of what it means to be an adult as being a capable person. So I'm curious what your thoughts on this, and how you have experienced overlaps between being infantilized as a disabled person and also as an adoptee. Anyone wants to start? Mitja?
I can start, but maybe I'm not the best to start with on this question, but if no one else.
I can start if you want. Malin, you can start because I started.
Okay. Then I start. Well, I think the biggest infantilization when I was a child was that when I was out with my mother or my friends or anyone else, they talked to that person and not with me. Like when I was in a shop or in a restaurant or in a cafe or something, and when I paid, when I gave money and they gave change back, they gave to the other person that was with me. So that was really, I felt like I wasn't existing almost when they, people were talking over my head. Because when I was a child, like I said before, before I was 9 years old, I walked with crutches, short distances, but I had my mother. she had this sulky. It was called sulky. It's like a wagon, and she was driving me. So I wasn't able to be on my own because she was always, and then she met people she knew, and she always stopped and talked to them, and they talked about me over my head a lot. And another thing is that I was always told that I was so good. I didn't do anything, but I was really good. I was good in driving my own wheelchair. I was good to do that and that and that. And that was also kind of, I felt very bad about that because then I didn't know what was, when I was older and people said, oh, you're so good, I wasn't able to receive it because I thought they said it because I was disabled. And I was, after gymnasium, do you say? I don't know what it's called. After gymnasium, sorry?
High school.
Is it high school? Okay, after high school, I was applying to become a teacher, a primary school teacher, and then they said I have to go there and talk to the, to the principal. Now, my English is really bad. I'm sorry. And he said, oh, are you able to work as a teacher? Are you really, and maybe I don't know if it's normal or natural they do that, but for me it was such a, of course I'm able, because it's only my legs, what's the difference to become a teacher? I don't know if they still do that, but yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And as an adoptee, people usually say adopted child, so that's also infantilizing, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. Angelica, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, now I think though, because I haven't been visible dysfunctional, so I haven't experienced that much of it, especially when I was young, because they didn't think I was sick. So according to the disability, I haven't experienced that much. But when I do, I'm not sure if it is because disabled that I think that they're talking to me as a child, or because I'm adoptee and they and I have experienced the infiltration with as an adoptee, because sometimes when I work just part-time because of my disabled, and at work, if I sometimes have more energy in work, people talk to me like I don't know my own energy, and are worried, and I don't think they mean to talk to me in like a infantile way, but it feels like it when they are not trusting me to be a grown woman, to know my own boundaries and my own strength. But at the same time, I know people that have chronic sickness sometimes push themselves a bit more because they want to use the energy they have when they have it, and so it's like a weird balance. But I'm not sure which part it come from, because it might just as well be because I have experience. Every time I talk about adoption, I am really infantile. I think the word is difficult, sorry, but I feel like I'm being treated like a child every time I'm talking about adoption, and that it happens so many times that every time anybody speaks of anything else that could seem like that, I might go there easier. I don't know, but since I'm not visible, I don't think I have the most experience of being yes, treated like a child. Because of my disability.
Yeah, so a quick comment before I move on to you, Mitja, is just that so when we compare both of your experiences, it sounds like the infantilization regarding your disability is very much bound up on the visible, that if you do not physically appear disabled, the chances that you will be infantilized because of your disability might lower. And I think I recognize that. I did not. I think it was not until I started perceiving myself as being disabled that I recognized that because of my voice and because of my pronunciation, and because in the past it was way more visible before I had the last surgery. I don't think I recognize the extent to which I have been infantilized because of it, and I think it is continuous for me because I'm not able to change my voice and my pronunciation of it, but because I've not had this awareness of myself for that long, I'm not able to decode those small processes of infantilization that I do think I experienced because of that. So I mean, it's also it's not only pertaining to the visible, but also to the audible. When you have something that's being perceived as a deviant tone or whatever. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. Mitja, do you have any comments on this?
I have two angles that came out from what you shared. One is with, I relate to what Malin says in my story. I only started using wheelchair in the age of 48 years old. I'm 51 now. So I got, because I fought for my rights, I got some assistance when I'm traveling, and I can get help for 13 days travel abroad. And that's where I'm using my wheelchair, because I don't have my disability car to use when I'm outside of Denmark. I especially experience in general this kind of infantilization after I used wheelchair, because if I have an assistant helping me, they would do as Malin said, they would approach the helper as if I'm not able to communicate myself, with which I am, of course. So there's a lot of education in educating the people around you when you meet some, let's say, services for disabled people in the airport or whatever. But that's a new experience for me. So I didn't experience this as a child. I experienced this as a very old woman now. And the other angle is I in particularly experience it. I'm currently in Korea studying Korean language. And it's been quite exhausting journey, physically, mentally, emotionally, but in particular because my struggle to see, can I study, constantly bounce against all the barriers that you will find in a country like Korea. Korea has signed the UN, they ratified the UN Convention on Disability Rights. That doesn't mean that they implemented all the things that we benefit from in Scandinavia. So if you can imagine returning to your birth country, and you might even want to dive into your, let's say, journals, records from the orphanage, how you're being treated, what kind of services you get. And in that context, you are being treated in an infantile way, that you're an adopted child who wants to get access to your papers. But in the structural settings, you know, how to get around in Seoul, in Korea. And this time I'm on my own. I don't have a helper, which has been, of course, humongous challenging, because I wanted to attend a university, and there are 40 universities in Seoul, and no matter how much I researched and approached and wrote, I couldn't get the assistance or help or advice or contact person how to organize studying 10-week intensive language course, which is something that is offered for Korean adoptees who went overseas. And so in this extent, in this context, I can relate to being an old woman, but being treated in a way that I feel very powerless, you know. And of course, it adds up that you don't have access to the language and they don't speak English. So the disability is even bigger, but it's not that I don't put a lot of energy into complain loud in these structures, but I did experience that when I reached out for help in the resources that are available for adoptees, that I experienced being discriminated, because somehow I would have more needs or difficult needs, or I would kind of insist on getting better or more answers to avoid not constantly bouncing into these barriers as being a wheelchair user. Not in an infantile way, but yet it resembles the feeling that I'm struggling again to get access to something I really want, just the same way as other adoptees who are able have accessibility for. That's the reason I started the Access to Korea Facebook group, the workshop regarding Korean adoptees with a disability. And I also want to repeat that it's not about just physical disability. It can be that your cognitive abilities are so much under stress that you have difficulties organizing your routines, how to get from A to B to C, how to get the support you needed, or how to get access to information or translation, etc. And so I kind of balance to be in a country, in a context where I gather information, I gather data, what it is like to being disabled in Korea, and hopefully I can at a later point share it, and what is actually needed, because the response I get is like, oh, but this is a country that is not good for disabled people, wheelchair users, etc., and we're very sorry. And my stance is, where I come from, it's like, that's the difference between a Scandinavian country and South Korea, is that some of the laws, some of the rights that we do have, you know, it's not just a paper from UN, but those are rights that are supposed to be implemented. I think there is this kind of understanding that I shouldn't expect to get those standards met in Korea. And where I'm talking from, nobody gets any changes done unless somebody speaks up and say, hey, I need better access here, or better service, or some kind of help here, because the rights we gain comes from, from fighting for it. And that's the hardship. And so on an emotional level, I can feel very powerless and very like a child again. The same way, which immediately reactivated my early trauma being 2 years old in the orphanage in South Korea. So on an emotional level, I struggle with kind of try to get my needs met, try to communicate it, and not feel discouraged, and keep coming back and asking or writing, and to get access as much as possible and gather experience and later on share it, for example, on a conference like this. That's what I would say to this.
So I very much agree with you. Before we move on to the questions, I just have 2 comments. One is that I think your story touches upon this expectation that remigration is a homogeneous experience among, at least among Korean adoptees, which it is very much not. So the mixed adoptee group must also have a different experience of not being able to return to a country where there is this visible similarity among the majority and yourself. And when we return as disabled, we also have a different experience. And so that pushes back on the dominant narratives of remigration. The second thing I also think that needs to be mentioned here is that what it also points to is the minoritization that happens within a minoritized group, within this group that we are as minoritized people of adoptees, and something which I have been interested for a long time, because I think that there are some hierarchies, and we unfortunately don't have time to talk about this, but maybe that's a topic for a different conversation. But it is something that I would like to encourage people to think about, how processes of minoritization also take place within our own communities. So we will move on to the questions now. And Louise, you...
All right, I will remove the pins so that we can see everybody, and just so you know that you will no longer be in panel mode. But it should be okay, except for Mitja, which I cannot remove the pin on. So all questions will go to you, Mitja, just so you know. But I actually have a question, so just to start the ball. I know Gabriel also have a question, but I have one question, if that's okay. Great, Gabriel. So I just want to ask the panel if they could elaborate a little bit about whether you have experienced the hierarchies among disabilities, like you have experience of that certain disabilities, as you talked a little bit about, Mitja, gives access to certain privileges where other disabilities doesn't, and also in general in the adoptee community, like whether you have experienced there are certain disabilities that are more acceptable or embraced than others. Just to, if I don't, it's an open question to the whole panel.
Anybody want to start?
I start? I have experienced that having lupus, it's a sexy sickness. It's a sexy diagnosis, because when I call to the hospital and say that I'm struggling with something, and they ask me if I have any diagnosis, and I say it's lupus, every doctor want to see me, because it's exciting. It's sickness that are not very common, and it's very complex. So in the hospitals, I have understood that I'm exotic patient, and sometimes that doesn't feel very great, but at the other way of looking at it, it makes me have a lot of help. So every time if I have something with my heart or anything, I have been admitted at the hospital several times because I have diffuse symptoms of stuff. I always get like a real full what you call it, full checkup, because every doctor from every avdeling, every
Department.
Department, they want to come and see. They want to see if they can understand what happens. I don't know if they have seen too much on this what you call him, the doctor who's it's a program where a doctor, he's like House. If you have seen House, he always looks for lupus, and sometimes I feel like that patient, that everybody's looking for the lupus thing though. So that is very strange. But I've heard other people with other type of disease, for instance, if they have fibromyalgia, I don't know how that is they are not experiencing the same treatment, because that is a sickness that are more looked at as a mental thing and are not acknowledged, but they have the same symptoms as me, and I get like the full checkup. So I absolutely have experienced some hierarchies and discrimination. Yeah.
I would say, so personally, I would say that I experienced it in a way where, because I passed as able-bodied, people will, and I think that they do it with good intentions, that they will tell me that I'm not disabled, and it is meant as a compliment. And what that tells me is that there is a hierarchy between being disabled and not being disabled. So that is one way I experience it. And, of course, I also, I have eyes, so I observe these like small processes when we are all gathered as Korean adoptees. And I do think that there is a hierarchy between able-bodied adoptees and disabled adoptees, and I don't think that we talk about it, at least not enough. So yeah. Gabriel or Malin, do you have something?
I can just say that in the disability world, I guess that the smaller disability you have, the higher in the hierarchy you are. And in the physical disability world, people who are in accidents and get physical disability when they are older, or I guess they have more, are higher in the hierarchy than if you are born with a physical disability, because the people who have been in accidents, they have also stronger voices and more competence and more capability to be political and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the hierarchy within world of disabilities is basically transferred to the community of adoptees. Gabriel, sorry, you've had your hand up for so long.
No worries. First, thanks to the panel. Great to hear you talk and hear your views. And to Angelica, I have sarcoidosis. It's also autoimmune. It's the same for me. I go into hospital and they jump on me and they're like, okay, want to point at me. I have two questions for the panel. First of all, how angry are you? And second, what are your thoughts about the white savior complex about with the adoptive parents who nowadays, I've spoken to many, or I've argumented with many when I talk about adoption and that I am against adoption and why. And then they always say, well, nowadays we adopt children who have some kind of disability and we will help them better here than they could be helped in their own country. And I kind of know what to say and what to answer to them, but what are your thoughts? So maybe I can have some more, information when I speak to them and argue with them about adoption. Thank you.
How angry are you? Anybody who's angry? I'm angry. Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Well, I can speak to that. Of course, I had to work with my anger, especially towards my adoptive father, in particular because he was a part of the structure that adopted the difficult children. The children were difficult to place. Terrorsum, who was the same organization that Mette came from, and both my adoptive parents are passed away, and he was the last one to pass away. What I did was I worked a lot in therapy regarding this. So my anger is more my anger is more, how can I say, what's left is the anger that arises every time that I feel that injustice of being left out or discriminated in the structures that exist, if it makes sense, the day-to-day structures. I heard you speak yesterday, Gabriel, being a person with the black color, how you would be, on a very aggressive or very direct way harassed. So that's not the experience I would have as a disabled person, right? But I would feel the anger when there's something I would like to do that I'm denied because, for example, I'm at a university supposed to study, but sorry, they don't have an elevator, so I'm being put in the online class. And I explained to the university, I flew into Korea. It's quite an expensive trip to do in a COVID-19, etc. And it wasn't really my choice or my wanting to sit behind a computer screen, right? Yeah. Learning Korean language. So that would be my day-to-day task to regulate that emotion and accept things as they are. But what really pisses me even more is when I'm not able to, with the capacities I have left. Before I had not so bad disability and my skill would be my head, but now my head is also disabled. So I cannot even use my head to upgrade in a language I want to reconnect to my original lost mother tongue. This pisses me off. And not just because it's difficult for me personally from a learning point of view, you could call it learning disability now, but from the point of view that the things that would minimize the struggle, I cannot do anything about them because they are structural. So that pisses me off. So I have to regulate that as well, right? Yeah. And kind of sit on it. And it comes out from small little situations where I feel that I'm being left out. And you experienced just a little glimpse today where I felt I couldn't even enter this conference regarding this topic because, so in my situation, I needed to arrive and prepare to calm myself. I've been very anxious about doing this talk. And then suddenly some minor thing happens, a technical thing, right? And my whole system flares up. And I think you can relate to that, Gabriel. You get so angry. So a small trigger, right? And it stems from many years of not being able to do what other people were able to, but never having anyone to kind of mirror that or understand that that's a very lonesome place to be is so painful. But it's even more painful when you lose your power, because now your body is not obeying your wishes anymore. So the power I had before, where I was more able, I lost that as well. I hope that was an answer.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts about the white savior complex, the parents wanting to adopt children with disabilities?
Well, in my case, I quickly shut the conversation by saying that for me, it wasn't a happy adoption story. I don't go into explaining the kind of abuse I was put to.
No.
Because
I mean more like today, because I talk to a lot of new adopted parents who maybe have kids that are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, and they're like, no, but it's not as it used to be when they stole kids. We take them because they have a disability and no one wants them, and we are better suited here in Sweden to take care of them than they are in Korea or Ethiopia or wherever. What are your feelings about people thinking in that way today, and is maybe a question, how do I talk back to them and try and tell them that it's still wrong, or is it wrong? Yeah, that's my question.
well, I can start. No, you want to go ahead, Malin?
Yeah, I would say like this, Gabriel, that I think the biggest issue is for example, in Korea, that parents are not able to keep their children with disabilities because it costs so much money to get all these hjälpmedel, I don't know, aid, like wheelchairs and
Devices.
hearing aid and all that. So some parents have to either leave their children on institutions or give them away. So I think it's that the focus should be on for example, South Korea, that they have to change the system that that people can keep their children with disabilities, and to say that children with disabilities are equally worth, and that's not it's not like that now. So we need to change attitudes and values.
Yeah, and I think
I just want to hear Angelica. Angelica has had her hand up for a long time.
In some way, I don't feel I can be too bastant. Since I don't have a visible disability, I wasn't adopted because somebody was trying to save me from a country that couldn't have me or help me, or from parents that couldn't afford the medical bills. So in a way, I cannot speak from that position. But when I got my diagnosis, some of it was that if I have been in Colombia and been undiagnosed like I was until I was 26, I probably wouldn't have survived 26. So when I understood my diagnosis, I got a bit mad because I didn't want to have one more reason that it was okay for me to be in Norway. And when I was thinking about maybe I wouldn't reach 26 because my disease needed so much medication that are extremely expensive, and in Norway we just get it for free, but in Colombia my family wouldn't have been able to afford it. I got mad because it only added to the the arguments of me being here. And at the same time I was thinking, I think I'd rather being dreaming about living in a country like Norway or Denmark or Sweden with others in Colombia and just I'd rather be part of existing without all this extra things, like all these identity problems, not problems, but identity issues, this feeling of racism and this feeling of not belonging. I'd rather exist in Colombia with those who I can relate to and dream about countries like this, and taking my problems with them down there. I think it would be better, because the other things are so much more complex. And yeah, so I don't know if that actually answered anything, but for me, it was when I got that diagnosis, I got just a bit more mad that, oh my God, now people are going to use that against me. and that's my take on it, that it doesn't mean that you are thinking about the child when you're taking them out of the country. I will just say that if you really, really care about the child, give money to those who are caring for the child where the child is, and make sure that they can actually make the day go around in where they are, in close to their environment, and not moving them around to the other side of the globe, because that's not caring for the child. That's just caring for you being a good person, like the white saviorism mentality.
Yeah, so I think we're going to move on to the last question. How many people have raised their hands?
Just Young-Hee.
Okay, so that's Young-Hee.
All right, great. Yeah, I have also comments for what you said, Gabriel, but I'm going to leave, due to time-wise, I'm going to leave that, but we can take a talk about that later as well, because I think it's the same, you can use the same arguments as you can use against adoption, you know, like it is a capitalistic structure that enables this way of thinking. But I wanted to ask the panel about, because I've been thinking about, there is a tendency that certain disabilities becomes trendy. And it becomes trendy because Netflix makes a series, for example, with people with cerebral palsy. A couple of years ago, it was, and when I say trendy, like, please read my brackets around it, but that becomes focused on it. There was a huge focus on anxiety issues. So for you who has been living with this way of with these disabilities, like, can you feel a difference in the approach to your disability, and is it like positive or negative? Because I'm really debating with myself about the terms of representation of disability, because it can also become, I think, maybe even more visible in the wrong way. So I was just thinking, because there is this kind of like documania at the moment. So like all kinds of streaming wants to do a lot of documentaries around different things. So there is this dating within the spectrum and these kinds of weird series where disabilities becomes highlighted in an entertainable way. I'm just thinking whether you have a thought about that or given that a thought.
I just want to say my disability has never been trendy. I don't think it ever will be.
You never know.
But anybody of you who have any thoughts on this?
My only experience is House, when House was looking for lupus. I don't know if it was trending, but every time I say lupus, people like, no, it's never lupus, or have you seen House? And like my disease has been portrayed there, and it's been portrayed in a way that is absolutely not correct, because every time he doesn't figure out what it is, it's probably lupus, and lupus is not treatable, so just go and die. Like, that's the way he says it. And no, it's not. It's complex, but it's not complex. And I don't know if that have affected anything. I don't know. It's the only thing I can say I have experienced about trending.
I experience a big difference now from from when I was a child, and I think people with disabilities in media is a big component in that difference, that it's more like you said, Youngson, we are more represented in different documentaries and TV series and all that in a positive way. But I saw a very interesting documentary on Swedish television about how people with disabilities are narrative in media, and that was really interesting. I will not go into that right now, but I can really recommend it on Swedish SVT Play. Yeah, so I think people treat me differently now, and that's since I was a child. Yes.
Okay, so Mitja, do you have anything to say to this, or okay? So I think that was it for today. Thank you so much for your participation. It was a super interesting conversation, and we plan to upload this either as a podcast or a video. I mean, it's going to be uploaded somewhere, and we will also collectively transcribe what we've talked about today, so it'll be available for those who are hard of hearing. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.